Well, hello, everybody, 7th grade students. No need to adjust your screens. For a moment there, you're thinking, oh my goodness, I'm about to fall off of a ledge, stories and stories down to the pavement. What an optical illusion this is, right? Terrifying. Look how calm, cool, and relaxed this guy is. Working on top of a building. He's taking a lunch break. He's got a sandwich here. That sandwich looks delicious. I'm kind of jealous, a little hungry right now. But my goodness, look at these working conditions. Just harrowing, right? Here's what we got, folks. We're talking about cities. Talking about cities and the growth of cities and the innovations that kind of came out of necessity, right? When it comes to cities, people move in, cities grow. You got to keep up. You got to keep building, even if that means building at the very, very tops of skyscrapers and taking a lunch break way up there. Let's get to the introduction. You don't have to forgive me. A little bit of a delay every time I click. I'm not really sure why, but here we go. Here's the introduction. Experts said it was impossible. It would be the longest and highest bridge ever built. The foundations for its stone towers would have to be constructed underwater in special chambers filled with compressed air. Completed in 1883. The Brooklyn Bridge still stands as a monument to American creativity. In the late 19th century, architects and engineers changed the face of the nation through innovations like steel bridges, skyscrapers, electric lights, elevators. That's what we're talking about. Necessity breeds creativity. We have necessity. We have a need. We have a crisis, an emergency of cities that we have to get better, or, well, it's going to get worse if we don't get better. So, let us continue. It's chapter 26 titled Builders and Dreamers. You've got a student guide, and of course, you take that quiz right over here. 304 Building Up. Let's do it. Now, we've got 3 questions that are going to drive our conversation in the next few minutes together here. What innovations appear as cities grow larger and more urbanized? Where are urban areas, and what influences where urban areas are? Speaking of urban areas and cities, urban cities, hopefully you're familiar and you are comfortable with that term. When cities get really, really, really big, uh, they're going to turn into something else. And that thing is a megalopolis. What is a megalopolis? Do we have any? Where are they in the United States? So we're kind of going to connect the dots between today and modern times all the way back to the 1880s. Really going to connect historical dots. First, let's start with cities. They're growing. It's been a massive theme in United States history so far together. You know, we've been talking Civil War and post-Civil War, and one of the things we know that happens at a breakneck pace, a very fast pace, is the fact that cities grow. Simple to say, but when you really kind of pause and look around and let it soak in, the fact that cities are growing, it's something that the world has never seen before, and we're going to have to deal with socially, economically, business-wise, ethically, all kinds of things. But let's take a look at some of the nuts and bolts. As we do, cities have been growing since 1865. Let me show you some stats here. It's going to blow your mind. We're going to talk about innovations, but let's set the scene. Between these time periods, between these between these dates that we've been looking at so much for this first quarter of the year, between 1860 and 1910, pretty safe to say that the rural population, like out there in the country, out there on farms, remote areas, the country's been growing, folks, and so they've doubled their population. Well, how about that? Small towns. But when you compare to the cities, urban populations, city populations, in these 50 years grows 7 times over. 7 times in 50 years. It's not that much, folks. 50 years. It goes 7 times. Crazy. If that's not crazy enough, let's continue to pick this thing apart. When it comes to cities, recognize that if you count up all of the cities at the time, and by 1910, that have populations of more than more than 50,000 people. That's like the city of St. Cloud or so. Oh, but St. Cloud's a little bit bigger than that or so. But if that's familiar to you in the state of Minnesota, cities with 50,000 or more in population, there were only 16 in existence in the entire country in 1860. By 1910, 109. My goodness, that is significant population growth. And let's go ahead and drive this thing home. Let's talk about something we know in our neck of the woods. Within these 10 years, 10 years, 1880 to 1890, Chicago doubles, and good old Minneapolis triples its population. So I've made the case. It's easy enough to say, oh, and the cities grew. Well, come on, that's whatever. But we really look at it. Wow. When you move that quickly, you need to innovate. You've got to make some changes, or it's not going to work out very well for human beings in cities. Let's look at some innovations. This is the fun stuff. As we move forward in our slides, quite the delay here. We got new inventions. They're going to change ways of life, particularly in these cities, urban areas. We'll look at a few right now. First, the one you may not have seen coming that you're going to read about in your chapter is the elevator. Shocker, I know. It's interesting to think about how it wasn't really the building materials that limited the height of buildings, what we think of as skyscrapers. It was the way to move around. It took the invention of an elevator to really get skyscrapers going. We had the steel available to us, so that lightweight, strong material. Like here, buildings made out of steel. It really was the elevator that made these take off. You think of skyscrapers nowadays, in the 2000s that we are in. You think of skyscrapers, you probably don't think about this. But this was one of the first skyscrapers ever built. In our modern minds, we think of them much, much, much taller. But at the time, 1880s, 1890s, these are some of the tallest buildings in some ways in the world. These are skyscrapers, buildings that are touching the skies. So we're going to have some names attached to these. People are moving into the cities. We have to make space. We can't create more land, but we can build up. That was the need. That was the motivation. We can't spread out any further because people are mainly walking. If they're not walking, they might have a horse. They definitely don't have a car quite yet. So we don't have more land, we must build up and create space that way. So we've got steel and we've got elevators. Thank you to Mr. Otis. There it is. Lightweight, strong, use the frame. And you got a whole new world of architecture and art form added to this. You get some new names like Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright being one of those that's going to stamp his name into the history books as having his own unique brand of architecture. And it really has its roots way back here, 1890s or so. More so than this, we have the Brooklyn Bridge. I'm excited for you to read this part in your chapter. I won't give it all away, but here's the idea. There's drama. There's life and death involved. In 1883, the steel suspension bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, is complete. And wouldn't you know, it's still around today. I've personally not actually been here, not in my grown-up life anyway. I think I was there when I was like 2. But anyway, it's still there. A bridge built in 1883 is still there in the broad cities of Brooklyn and New York City. And again, it's about innovation. It's about connecting. It's about adapting as people are moving into these areas at such a ridiculously fast pace. We got an older photo here showing the peoples of the 1880s and a more contemporary modern photo here. You move into cities, you've got to get better, improve your systems, or the cities will fail. We're just looking at the innovations. We haven't talked about the issues with jobs or issues with social issues or race or ethnicity. There's going to be all kinds of issues moving forward. But for now, we got to talk the innovations to physically make it work. Infrastructure. So again, you can enjoy some photos here of the Brooklyn Bridge. Still very much in use today, ladies and gentlemen. Still very much in use today. The older I get, the less comfortable I am with scenes like this. I think that's what happens. Every year, you get a little older, you just start to get more afraid of things. Like heights and flying. Hot air balloons and such. There you go. Some of my deep, dark fears right there. Pretty phenomenal images. This bridge is massive, and you're going to go ahead and read it yourself. Here's a cool forced perspective for you art folks. And it's kind of interesting to see what is not yet built. That's why I show this. I know it's a bit fuzzy, but you get the idea of what is not yet there in New York City and in Brooklyn in the 1880s compared to what you see now. And yet these are still categorized as skyscrapers. So moving forward, let's go to our next question. Oh, here we go. Sorry. The backgrounds of what is and is not there changed a little differently from 1880s to the 2000s. Moving along with our questions, let's do this. More kinds of innovations. It's not just bridges, not just elevators or skyscrapers. We have a whole new thing called landscape architecture. I know it doesn't necessarily seem like the most critical thing, but recognize that these landscapes take on a whole identities of themselves to become such vitally important areas of cities in general. Here, 3,800 men, 20 years to complete what we take for granted today as something as simple as Central Park in downtown Manhattan, New York. To associate a name with this, we would think of Frederick Law Olmsted, the idea of creating not just a park, but really improving land. That's the key word. Throughout the 1800s and late 1800s, there's this mentality of improving the land. Improving the land could mean putting not cotton, but something like planting wheat fields or having agriculture. That's improving the land, or damming a river to have power. That's improving the land in the late 1800s. Sculpting the land for specific purposes, that's the big idea, improvement. We can argue today about what is and is not improvement, but at the time, that was the idea. So moving forward, our second question is this. We looked at the movement of cities and some innovations that are kind of popping up during this time. But I keep using this word urban. It means cities. Where are these areas? Where are the urban areas? And what influences where they are? So this is where we're going to kind of connect the dots from the 1880s all the way to today, because a lot of the patterns that we see now got started way back in the 1880s. So let's do this. Look at the pointer tool. I'm sorry we're not together live, so I can't ask you to use the pointer tool. I'm sorry, I'll have to do it myself. Let's identify the urban areas. You can see it here on the map that is shown before us. A little bit older. We should probably update this, but really the pattern is out there, and this has not changed in its pattern. The darker spots are the urban areas, the city regions. So here in Minnesota, of course it's more urban, more city-like, right smack dab here by Minneapolis. Lots of urban areas in the Great Lakes regions, Northeast, New York, Boston, Washington. Let's zip down over here to Dallas, to Houston, and of course, our neighbors to the west, San Francisco and a good portion of California. These are the urban centers. These are the urban centers that get started in the 1880s and only grew and grew and grew and grew. It's not like things shifted over at some point and the map was wiped out. No, what we're seeing in the 1880s and what we're studying and reading about, it only continues to the point where we are today with where people are living. Population-wise, significantly more today in cities than rural areas. And that was already in place by about 1920 or so. Moving a bit further, though, you have to ask the question of why. Like, what is it about these regions that the populations grew, that people flocked to them? It could be a natural resource. Think out here in California, it could be water, it could be gold, it could have been the Comstock lode out here, which is a mining community in Nevada. It could have been, let's zip over here, I don't know, a river and Mill City, so you can mill wheat flour, right? In Minnesota, it could be the Great Lakes regions where you're shipping stuff out. It could be manufacturing centers. It could just be a simple water source where rivers come together like St. Louis. You could have a workforce nearby, bodies of water. These are the types of things that draw people into cities. And so lastly, to connect our final dot, this has only grown. Like I said, by the time 1920 rolls around, more Americans are in cities than not. And that has continued worldwide until like 2012 or so, where like more human beings are in cities than not. And so this has only grown and grown and grown to the point we have such massive urban centers, we don't call them cities anymore. We are starting to see this new phenomenon called a megalopolis. Such fun to say. I encourage you to say it out loud, even if you're watching this recording later on your own. A megalopolis. Just really satisfying to say. Let's identify our own megalopolis trends right here in the U.S. of A. What is it? Well, just kind of said it. It's massive city centers that are just kind of bleeding into each other. And maybe you already have Maybe you already have an idea in mind of where we're going to find those. Let's stick home right here in Minneapolis, going back to the same map. We would call this kind of the Great Lakes region between Minneapolis, Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, even over here to Cleveland. This is the Great Lakes region. That's its own. Let's look at the East Coast. Of course, that's populated with city after city after city. New York City, Boston, Washington, Baltimore, and we already talked about San Francisco and the West Coast. When we put it all together, we are seeing some massive megalopolis regions developing in our own United States. I told you we're connecting the dots today. From 1880s all the way to today in the 2000s, we're connecting dots. What got started post-Civil War, people moving into the cities, it never stopped, folks. There was never any light switch that was turned off and said, and then we reset the map. No. What started just after the Civil War has only snowballed bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, with more population settling into these same regions that they did 100 years ago and only getting larger. And so, to land the plane here that we always do, we had our 3 questions to answer. We talked about reminding each other of how much growth cities are experiencing quickly. And what started after the American Civil War has only continued. We had a few innovations pop up, like skyscrapers and using steel for building, and landscaping and elevators. These things are starting to pop up that we take for granted that there was an origin to these. We talked urban centers, and even all the way to today, this concept of a megalopolis. So here's a cheat sheet if you'd like to pause on this or screenshot or whatever. You should have the PDF slides in your lessons as well if you want to take a look. Otherwise, say thanks for watching. I'm excited to get back together and to do this live in our Class Connect sessions, but we'll go with this for now. No exit ticket for the week. We'll just remove that requirement to make it just that much clearer and easier. Thank you so much for those who are watching. We'll see you soon. Bye. Thanks, everybody.